Brock is into the pits.
Indeed, there's action in the pits. We watch
Peter Brock, the man who is leading the race, has just called into the pits in car 1.
Pole position for the time yesterday of 2:24.1 is the Peter and Philip Brock car for Bill Patterson race.
Man who had pole here last year and who won the race last year, who led throughout last year.
He's gone at the time of about 25 seconds, and he is gassing in the Commodore.
Peter in 1969 was teamed with Des West, who was an experienced hand, and that was all part of the purpose by Harry Firth to give a guiding hand to a very young Brock in his first trip up there.
Colin Bond has been one of Foxy Firth's star pupils in recent weeks. But now the 1 minute siren has gone and all is ready for a start with 2 Falcons and a Holden on pole position.
I think Harry sort of looked at the situation that he had, and mind you, Ford had already got a lot of the good drivers. So what was left? There was Peter and Desi West. Desi West had been to Bathurst many times, had very good results there. And I just think Harry sort of looked at it and thought, well, you know, there was Peter, there was me, we were cheap as well. The race went perfectly to plan as far as we were concerned. We had no problems during the race. Peter and Desi West also had no problems.
Colin Bond pilots a careful course around the final lap, taking no chances of spoiling the patient efforts of himself and co-driver Tony Roberts.
We both went very well on the day, to the extent that afterwards, you know, it was Peter and myself that stayed with the team, and the others virtually didn't.
Increasing in velocity, the wind places additional strain on drivers of the smaller vehicles.
1971 and that early period of the 70s was an interesting period because it was in the days where Bathurst was done primarily by solo drivers. You didn't have to have a co-driver like you do these days. So 1971, Brock's in one Tirana, Bond's in another.
Harry Firth sounds philosophical.
Colin's going very well. Well, they both are, you know, they're both doing the same lap time. With this, all you do is you poke along at the best speed you can, and whatever comes out at the end, that's what you get.
But they still weren't an outright contender to the Falcons, as had been the case in 1970. So the XU1 Tiranas again were competitive, but not quite to the level, and Moffat went on and won Bathurst once more.
Moffat's nearest opponent is over a lap behind, and his overall time of 6 hours, 9 minutes, 49.5 seconds betters the previous record by over 20 minutes.
I need to remind you that the road will be very much like a pork chop, so we would crave that you exercise a little caution.
There's no doubt that 1972 Bathurst is the day that Peter Brock arrived in the sporting conscience of Australia and its public.
Well, the story of the race should be that the conditions will aid the Tiranas fully. These small, light machines with their powerful 6-cylinder engines and superb suspensions will be better balanced in the wet.
I know it sounds stupid, but we only had one set of wet tyres mounted, another set of intermediates mounted. And Harry said to me, what do you want? And I looked and I said, I'll take the wets, you know, which are a Goodyear wet. And then the boys pushed the cars out onto the grid and we walked out. There was no warm-up laps in those days. And I looked at my car and I got the intermediates on and Peter's got the wets on. And I said to Harry, geez, Harry, I thought I was going to have those. And he said, oh, don't worry, Cock, this rain won't last. Well, he was right. It didn't last, but neither did I.
Man who won the 69 500 in the Monaro.
Look at Bondy,
and he's gone. He's gone. Look. Oh, don't make it. Look, Colin Bond who crashed and re-cut.
Bond gone, Holden's hopes right with Brock and Moore, and they're pushing Moffat hard as he skates the big Falcons down through the entrance.
I was leading, and I lost it in the rain, and so I'm going like this, and I thought, well, I'm going to just half scrape the embankment, so Peter will have to stay behind me. Well, he went up on that embankment, by which time I was already turning more and leaving more room on the actual tarmac. But he was no galah behind the wheel, mate. He could just go and he was gone.
Moffat's spot. He's up a bank and re-parked near where Bond went. That's 2 quick body blows to Ford. Gibson crashes, and now Moffat in trouble. That puts Brock and the Holden Tirana into first place.
Yeah, Peter gave a very good race that year. The wet and the power of the Fords were not as good as they were in the dry, of course, you know. And Pete was able to stay with Moffat most of the time. You know, Moffat spun, I think Freddie spun, you know, lots of spins and things. So and virtually left Peter winning the race, which was, you know, a great result for the team.
And Peter Brock goes across the line to win the 1972 Hardy Paredo 500.
Oh, I think it changed him a lot.
Rosalind, Brocky, and myself, we were only working on the cars. We didn't have an outside business. I certainly didn't. I think Peter had some people that were helping him, and GM certainly were sending him whatever he needed.
There's no doubt that 1973, of all of the years that Peter Brock could have won Bathurst, is the one that got away. It was the first year of the 1,000-kilometre race distance, so a co-driver was compulsory, and they picked a guy in Doug Shivers who was highly experienced. He was over 50 at the time, and they ended up with a situation where they were in front. They were in the upper hand position on Alan Moffat and the factory Ford team.
There won't be long before the leading Toronto comes into the pits and the number 1 slot passes to Shivers.
Doug is playing it very cool as far as fuel consumption is concerned, but unfortunately the fuel gauge has stopped working. But the car is misfiring 3 laps before it runs out through Forest Elbow. Just assuming that the fuel consumption is going to remain static, and you know, it should be okay.
And then they pushed it.
Go for maximum laps. They want Shivers to stay up for as long as he can.
And then they ran out of fuel.
And of course, those days, if you ran out of fuel coming down the straight, you could get back to the pits. But I think Doug tried to start it again, coming down the straight, and probably slowed it, so when it came into the pits, it didn't quite make it into the pit area.
Those officials can't touch the car.
Funny rules, but you weren't allowed to push the car until it was in the pits. And I think Doug had stopped just prior to, you know, and all the officials and the boys are there, and they're trying to make poor Doug push it up the hill, which was a little bit steep initially, and he wasn't a young man by those days either. But anyway, look, he managed to get it up, and then as they did, the officials said, "Yep, he's in," and the boys took over and pushed poor old Doug aside, you know, and I think he nearly collapsed in a heap there for a while. You look back and say, well, it was probably one that got away, you know, in a lot of respects, because, you know, had they not run out of fuel, those things happened, and the race has been run and won.
Watch Peter Brock demonstrate Tirana's improved handling, paced by our Tirana hatchback camera car.
Now, all Tiranas are equipped with radial tune suspension, and that means the car goes right where you point it. Watch me straighten this corner. The handling is really magic.
Brock is into the pits. Indeed, there's action in the pits as we watch 33. It'll be a sight that'll be well.
1974 for Brock with Brian Sampson was actually the start of a new era. Holden had been going 6 cylinders up against Ford's V8 at Bathurst for a couple of years. They got a win in 72, they came close in 73, but they knew that they needed 8 cylinders under the bonnet to match Alan Moffat and his Falcon cohorts when they got to the mountain. They were dominating the race. They were 6 laps in front, about 2/3 race distance, and then the engine failed.
Down the drain. Look at the smoke issuing from the tail of the leader. Now this is the Peter Brock, Brian Sampson car.
Peter detonated a piston, I think, or something like that, and, you know, it broke and blew smoke. These things happen. They were sort of cars, they were fairly fragile in their really, and you had to sort of work around a lot of the problems that they may have.
Peter Brock waits in the car while the mechanics try to see what's wrong. Look at the face.
Turn the pumps on.
Disappointment.
And there's no doubt that that's another one that got away from Peter Brock, just as had been the case in 1973.
Starting to cheer and to go mad. The 20-deep crowd on pit straight waving their arms.
The crowd acknowledge the man who's going to win this race. Only a kilometre to go now as Peter Brock goes for the last time down through the S's.
1975 was, I guess, the start of a new era for Brock. I mean, he'd left the Holden dealer team at the end of the previous year.
Again, the cheer goes up, he waves his acknowledgement to the crowd and the men holding the flags, the marshals all around the track.
So he teamed up with a couple of guys in Norm Gown and Bruce Hindhoff in Melbourne who had their own Tirana L34, little workshop in the suburbs, perfect fit for Peter at the time.
Takes time off to wave, he's got this race well and truly in his grasp, and Peter Brock will be feeling very happy now.
Peter finished up winning that particular race for going Hindhoff, and I think we might have finished third or something like that from memory. Again, it was just one of those races that got away from us, but advantage to Peter.
Meanwhile, back at the race, the leader is Moffat, then it's Bond, then Brock.
1976 is another one that got away from Peter Brock. That year he was in a Team Brock Tirana, so he'd actually formed his own team under his own banner, and it really was Team Brock because he had his brother Phil as his co-driver in 76.
To actually get to drive with him was sort of like a natural thing, and that, again, may sound weird. So, and because Peter got all the publicity, every time someone would walk in the tent, which is what we were in those days, I mean, they'd push me aside to get to talk to Pete, which is fine. And so he got used to that, so there was no great pressure on me.
Is Bob Morris, and the flame pouring from the exhaust there is from the engine of Peter Brock, last year's winner.
They were competitive again, but we were in an era there with Brock in the mid-70s where he was no longer the factory guy, but he still had really strong fan support. The 05 Drink Drive campaign was kicking in, and he was still becoming a really big star at the time.
It was fantastic to do because it was a real family thing with us. Mum and Dad were there, and Auntie, Uncle John, Auntie Marge, and what have you, and yeah, a great event. And we did pretty well.
Trouble there, you can see his hands left the wheel.
76 and probably, I didn't expect anything. So to get third was pretty darn nice, you know. But 77 was, that hurt.
The drivers are in the hands of the starter.
Holden fans look back at 1977 Bathurst as one that they've wiped.
Are also up in the air. Dennis comes to flag and dropped away in 77 with the Hardy Fredo 1000. All cars.
They were competitive, but they weren't fast enough and they weren't solid enough for long enough. And again, he was with his brother Phil, but unfortunately that win eluded him again, and he was forced to wait and watch as Alan Moffat took his final and fourth victory at the Mountain.